Real frames per second testing across 6 titles, the $240 7600X3D versus $349 7800X3D. We measured the delta, calculated cost per frame, and identified which games see 5% difference. We ran both CPUs on identical test hardware, MSI B650 board, 32GB, DDR5 6000 CL30, RTX 4070, and a 1TB Gen 4 NVMe. All tests at 1080p high settings to emphasize CPU load. Each title was tested 3 times and averaged Warzone 2 7600X3 D 178 frames per second, 7800X3 D 2 frames per second plus 7.9%. Counter-Strike 2 7600X3 D 441 frames per second, 7800X3D 468 frames per second plus 6.1%. Cyberpunk 2077 7600X3 D 142 frames per second, 7800X3D 151 frames per second, 6.3%. Fortnite 7600X3D 237 frames per second, 7800 X3 D243 frames per second, plus 2.5%. Valorant 7600 X3D 512 frames per second, 7800 X3 D 521 frames per second, plus 1.8%. Starfield 7600 X3 D 89 frames per second, 7800 X3 D 103 frames per second, plus 15.7%. Starfield is the outlier. The game scales heavily with thread count and cache, so dividing MSRP by average frames per second across our test suite gives a rough cost per frame metric. The 7600 X3D costs $249 and averaged 266 frames per second across all 6 games. The 7800 X3D costs $349 and averaged 288 frames per second. 7600 X3D 266 frames per second, il 936 songs per frame. 7800 X3D 349, 288 frames per second, equals $212 per frame. The 7600 X3DE offers 23% better cost efficiency. Put another way, you're paying an extra $100 for 22 frames per second on average. That $100 could instead go toward faster RAM, a better cooler, or upgrading from a 4070 to a 4070 Super, all of which would yield larger frames per second gains than the CPU swap on a 1000 forhin build redirecting. The 7800 X3D makes sense in 3 scenarios. First, if you're pairing it with a high-end GP, you like an RTX 4080 or RX 7900 XTX at 1080p or 1440. The extra cache and cores prevent CPU bottlenecking in AAA titles. Second, if you play heavily modded games like Cities Skylines 2 or heavily threaded simulation titles, the 2 extra cores matter. Third, if you're building a rig you plan to keep for 5+ years and anticipate games becoming more thread hungry, the 7800 X3D has more headroom. We saw this in Starfield testing. The 7800 X3D maintained 103 frames per second in New Atlantis crowds, while the 7600 X3D dipped to 89 frames per second. That's a 16% gap. Most builders considering these CPUs are pairing them with GPUs in the $400–600 range. RTX 4070, RX 7800 XT, or RTX 4070 Super. At that tier, you're almost always GPU bound at 1440p and often at 1080p in demanding titles. The 7600 X3D rarely bottlenecks these cards. We tested both CPUs with an RX 7800 XT in Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p Ultra with ray tracing. The 7600X3D delivered 87 frames per second. The 7800X3D delivered 89 frames per second, a 2.3% difference well within margin of error. The GPU was pegged at 99% utilization in both cases. Unless you're chasing 360Hz esports frame rates at 1080p low settings, the 7600X3D doesn't hold you back. Don't pair. 4 of our 6 test titles showed under 5% frames per second difference. Competitive shooters and esports titles, Valorant, Fortnite, Counter-Strike 2 are all single-thread dominant and cache-sensitive, so both X3D chips excel. Warzone 2 showed a 7.9% gap, but both CPUs delivered well over 100 frames per second, making the difference academic unless you're running a 240 Hz plus monitor. The pattern: if a game is well optimized for 6 cores and doesn't hammer all threads equally, the 7600X3D keeps pace. The moment you hit a poorly threaded open-world game like Starfield or a simulation title like Cities Skylines 2, the 7800X3D's extra cores make a noticeable difference you can run a free playbook with. If you're building a $201,500 gaming rig with a mid-range GPU, the 7600X3D offers better value. You're getting 92% of the 7800X3D's performance at 71% of the cost. The $100 savings funds better RAM, a larger SSD, or a GPU tier bump, all of which yield higher frames per second returns than the CPU upgrade. The 7800X3D makes sense if you're pairing it with a high-end GPU, planning a 5+ year build, or running mixed workloads. The extra cores future-proof against increasingly threaded games, and the larger cache helps in AAA open-world titles. But for most builders, the 7600X3D is the smarter buy. Either way, both CPUs benefit from proper in-game. Build your free playbook for any GPU at betterfps.com/optimize.